Well, good evening, everybody, and good evening to Rosemary, who is very well known in the northern half of the circuit, and I think fairly well known in the southern half. Is that right, Rosemary?
I've sort of been around most places, I suppose.
And Rosemary is the victim tonight, and I am the perpetrator. So we'll start at the beginning, shall we, Rosemary?
The Inquisitor, I think, is the Inquisitor is the better. The Inquisitor is
that's right. Yes. I've got my torture chamber. Can we start at the beginning then, Rosemary, and you tell us how you started life? Where were you? And
dead ordinary. I was born in South Norwood in Whitworth Road, and I was the second child. My sister was 2, and just around the corner from where my grandparents lived. And both sets of grandparents, we all went to this Baptist church, which was called Holmesdale. And that's where my parents met and where they were married. So it was dead ordinary. And it was not all that far from the Crystal Palace, because I do remember when I was 4, my dear father coming into our bedroom and lifting me out of bed and say, "Darling, I want you to see something." We looked out of the window and there was a great glow in the sky. And he said, "That is the Crystal Palace burning down." And it was. And we'd been there only a few days earlier as visitors. You know, we'd been round. And my mother said, and I think she might have been right, that it was done deliberately because they knew war was coming and they thought it would be a marker for the bombers. So I'm remembering, I've got an incredibly good ancient memory. I can go back to 1936, that was, and the king dying and the new king and Mrs. Simpson and all that stuff. But it's my present memory where I forget things.
Well, we'll try and remind you as we go. So you had an older sister?
Yes, Alison.
And that was all? No,
because no, I had my brother came 18 months after me. I had them fairly quick in those days because family planning was a bit tricky. And I actually got on far better with my brother. My sister was a very good girl. She was always clean and tidy and did the washing up without being told. And I was always wanting to play mud pies with my brother and climb trees and things. So my brother and I are still terrific friends. But my dear sister has gone on before. She died about 5 years ago.
Thank you. And who were the special people in your early life?
My brother, Graham. He was very special. And of course, my parents, I mean, I had very good, loving parents. We were very fortunate. They loved each other and they loved us. Trouble was, money was very short because it was the 1930s and my father lost his job like a great many other people. We were not unusual. It was a very bad time. It was the Depression and things were really, really bad. So when I was 4, after a very quiet sort of Christopher Robin childhood in London, my father was out of work and got a job in Greater Manchester. So we moved to Manchester just as I was about to start school. And for some reason, we were in a mill area and there was a mill and a middle school. And I don't know why my mother sent us there, because there was another school in the opposite direction, which had a more mixed population. But we were sent to this mill school and they were all children from the mill workers. And in those days, there was a much greater divide between North and South. And of course, there was me with my London accent and very different background. And, they say, "Why do you talk funny? Why don't you talk proper?" And we had that all the time. And I just kept my mouth shut. And we went to this absolutely dreadful school. It was like something out of Dickens. And it really was appalling, very, very rough. And 70 children in a class and 3 classes in a great big hall. And we had sort of 3 positions: arms folded in front, arms folded behind, or hands on head. And if you moved, you got hit. And I was covered in eczema and nobody would sit near me because they all thought I was got leprosy or something. And so, I mean, it really was awful. The result was I was hardly ever at school. I was always ill, and I had practically no education until I was 11. I read because my sister taught me to read, so I could read, and I was brought up really by the BBC schools broadcasts were actually wonderful, and I listened to those avidly. And of course, the other great joy was that just round the corner from where we were living, a brand new Methodist church was going up, and my mother sought her conscience and decided that there was no Baptist church, and so we became Methodists, and it was wonderful.
That was your first experience of Methodism, was it?
Absolutely, and it was totally wonderful. And from I shouldn't be too rude because there are some awfully nice Baptists, and I've known some, but we used to sing little songs at the Sunday school. I remember being in floods of tears because we sang this, wounded for me, there on the cross he was wounded for me, all my transgressions and now I am free, all because Jesus was wounded for me. I learned that when I was 4, and I was in floods of tears because I couldn't think what on earth I'd done to hurt Jesus, because I loved him.
Mm.
And I thought it was dreadful. I must have done something absolutely terrible to hurt Jesus. So we were very, very ardent Christians at 4 years old, and had a very, very Christian family.
Mm. So then you went more often to school when you were 11, did you?
Well, yes, I was rescued. I was rescued by an uncle who didn't like children at all. And I remember him saying rather coldly to my mother, if you want her to grow up, I suggest that you do something about it and send her to a decent doctor. I was really grossly undersized, covered in eczema, and with awful migraine, and I was dreadfully sickly, and I wouldn't eat, so I was terribly thin. And so my mother pointed out that my father was missing, believed killed in the war, and that we had no money, and there was no question of paying for a doctor. And the best we could do was go to the chemist, which we did in those days. So he paid, and I went to see, I think he must have been a paediatrician. Can you believe, in Harley Street?
Oh, right.
He did the absolutely unforgivable. I mean, he'd get 10 years today if he did this. He sent my mother out of the room.
Yeah.
And store me on my own. And we had a long, long heart. Why was I so frightened? Why was school so terrible? Why wouldn't I eat anything? And he was absolutely wonderful. And then he called my mother in, and I remember him saying to me, will you eat anything? And I said, I do like chips. And I remember he said, my mother came in, and I remember him saying to her, chips for breakfast, chips for lunch, and chips for tea. And when she's put on some weight, you can vary it a little. I remember that so clearly. And he said, forget education. Just find the smallest private school you can, and forget education altogether. Education doesn't matter. What matters is that she's going to grow up.
Yeah.
And so we found a very small school with the help of the next door neighbour. And I have a feeling, I don't know because I never asked her, but I think she took me for nothing because she knew my father was missing and that we got no money.
Mm.
And this wonderful woman took me, and it was very gentle. You did a little gentle work in the morning, with a little bit of maths, a little bit of English, a bit of history, and a bit of geography. In the afternoon, we had some gentle needlework and art. In the summer, we played tennis and sat in the sun. In the winter, we played netball. And I just loved it. The only trouble was where the council school children had despised us because we didn't talk properly and we were absolutely wrong. This school, they were all a bit posh, and they rather despised me because I came from a council school, so I couldn't win. However, I got on all right there. And amazingly, they went round. I remember this girl coming around saying, Miss Gressley says, does anyone want to take school certificate? So I put my hand up. And 1 or 2 others did. So we took school certificates. So I got me 8 subjects.
Oh, well done.
Yeah.
So you were in Manchester during the war, were you?
Oh, yes, and the bombing. It was pretty terrifying. I mean, that was awful. Funnily enough, it brought us together in a way because, you were all having to dive down the shelter together. And we were given Horlicks tablets to suck, I remember, and we had to do practice with our gas masks, and we sang all sorts of very inappropriate songs to keep our spirits up and to disguise the sound of the guns. We sang things like Roll Out the Barrel.
As good Methodists would.
But the Methodist church was wonderful. That's where I was educated, because there were brownies and guides and junior choir, and then later on youth club. And of course, we were 3 times a Sunday. We went in the morning and the afternoon, Sunday school in the evening. And we had 2 or 3 ministers following each other who were totally brilliant. I was listening to sermons when I was 7 and 8. They were just brilliant, and they weren't talking down to you. No. But when we did have bad preachers, and we did sometimes when the minister was elsewhere, and meanwhile, of course, they all sang, and they really sang in those days. I'm not kidding. These mill workers, I mean, they'd hold the books right out in front of them, and they sang in parts. Bother you're all singing in unison. The men sang tenor or bass. My mother was a good contralto, and they sang their hearts out, and we sang Charles Wesley's hymns. And I just completely fell in love with Charles Wesley. So when we had a bad preacher, and we did sometimes, I used to read Charles Wesley's hymns, and I was totally in love. With Jesus as well as Charles Wesley.
Yes, oh good. So then when did you leave school?
Well, I went on then to the high school, and because I had got my necessary, it was school certificate in those days. So I went to sixth form then and went on to college, where I was extremely happy. I'd loved college.
And where were you at college?
Well, Warwick University as is now.
All right.
It was wonderful. I just absolutely adored it. For the first time in my life, I knew success. I actually did okay. I was all right there. I didn't believe I was a complete lunatic, complete dropout. Well, actually, that's not quite true, because at the private school I was, they thought I was okay there. But yeah, that was lovely. It was wonderful, wonderful.
So was that for teacher training?
Yes.
And then you met your husband?
No, I went to teach in a school for handicapped children with my best friend, who I was devoted and still am devoted to. In fact, it was her 90th birthday I went to when I went, not last November, the November before, for her birthday. And we were both teaching at this school together. And we were at college together and became great friends. And I didn't realize it at the time because I was so innocent. I'd never heard the word lesbian, but she was a lesbian. I didn't know it. I was totally innocent. And she was very much in love with me, which I didn't realize. And because I say I'd never heard of lesbians. And I was anyway totally in love with someone called Jeffrey, and was always mooning on about Jeffrey this and Jeffrey that. So she was very sweet and didn't bother me, but remained totally best friends and still are. To this day, we're still on the phone to each other. She's got a partner she's lived with for the last 60-odd, 70 years. And but I'm still absolutely close to her. And she's the godparent to my children. She's wonderful. So we've always had this deep, loving relationship, which has been a very important part of my life. She's loved. She's an Anglican.
So then how did you meet Paul?
Well, then I got the call, having left the church for 2 years. I tried to leave the church. I thought, I'd sort of had enough. And then, of course, what I couldn't get away from was Jesus, because he kept pursuing me. And so then I offered as a missionary. And I went to the Missionary Society and was accepted. And I was going to go to Nigeria. And I was sent to Kingsmead in Selly Oak in Birmingham to the Missionary Training College, where I was trained as a missionary. We did theology and all sorts of other things, which was great. Well, it was very interesting and great fun in lots of ways. And then Paul was home from Kenya. He'd been in Kenya all through the Mau Mau. And I didn't realize it at the time, but he was in his mid-30s by this time. I was still 24. And the Missionary Society, as it was called in those days, decided in its infinite wisdom that it was Dr. Bolton who was the missionary. He was the mission doctor. He was in charge of the medical missionaries. And he decided that Paul ought to have a wife because he was not looking after himself properly. So he sent him to Celio, very much against his will, protesting loudly. And to find, well, he didn't know he was sent there to find a wife, but what happened was he found me. So
and you'll do.
A sort of a lightning romance. Dr. Bolton wasn't in the least bit surprised. In fact, I have a feeling he got me lined up because Dr. Bolton was fond of me, and he was always very sweet to me. And I think maybe he thought that would happen, and it did. Paul was not in the women's college. He was in the men's college, but we met. In fact, we met because we both went to a Fellowship and Reconciliation meeting and came back to college together. His college was opposite mine. And then when we really got chatting was we all were asked to give blood, and the lorry came for blood donations and we all volunteered. And I was next to him in the queue, and he said, "Oh, what's your blood group?" And I said, "Oh, A positive." "Ah," he said, "cancer of the stomach." That was his chat up line. And he was a very clever doctor. And because he'd been at the Mau hospital in Kenya, all through the Mau. I mean, he was brilliant. And anyway, well, before we knew, we got it. I, of course, was in deep disgrace because in those days, it was incredibly difficult. They didn't approve of marriage and engagement. And we got engaged, and I was told we'd have to wait for 5 years. I'd have to go to Nigeria. And they did that. I mean, ministers weren't allowed to get married until they'd finished their training. They were incredibly fierce in those days. And then apparently Dr. Bolton intervened, and he said, "You do not keep an experienced missionary in his 35th year waiting 5 years until he's 40 to marry." So we were then instructed, it was women's work in those days, they were very fierce. I had a letter from Women's Work instructing us we were to get married immediately. It was terrible. They were very different, in those days.
Yeah.
So we booked a marriage, and then it was the Easter holidays, I think, and I went back to my parents, who were by this time living in Derbyshire, and I went back home, and Paul went home, and we were engaged by this time, and then we'd been watching the news, I think, and the telephone went, and my father came in looking very serious and said, "Darling, there's some very serious news. Paul has got tuberculosis and has got to go straight into a sanatorium." And he said, and then he said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Whatever you decide to do, I will go with you. I will back you up." I said, "Well, I'm going straight to Norfolk tomorrow." Paul was living in Norfolk by then. "I shall go to Norfolk tomorrow morning." He said, "Right." And he put me on the train next morning. I arrived in Norfolk. Paul met me at the station at West Brunton. And I said, "Right, I want to see the consultant." Because Paul had a job in the meantime at Kelling. It was a TB sanatorium then. And he'd had a routine x-ray, which discovered he'd got tuberculosis, which he caught from the Mau. The Mau prisoners were all full of tuberculosis. And so I said, "I want to see the consultant." So I went straight to see the consultant, and I said to him, "Would it be better for Paul to be engaged or married?" And he said, "Oh, without doubt, married." So I got on the bus and went straight to Cromer and got the special license, and we were married 3 days later.
Well done. As
one does.
Yeah.
And we were allowed to go. We had a wedding. We got what family could arrived. And my father, fortunately, I had already ordered a wedding dress. It was I still got it. My daughter's got it now. She got married in it. And my father brought the wedding dress, and we were married in West Brunton Methodist Church. And we were allowed to have a night together, which we had at Weybourne. And then he went into hospital. He went into Kelling for a year. And I visited him 3 times a week. And we had no money. And I had nowhere to live. And so I got a bed sit in Norwich. And I couldn't get a proper teaching job, but I got a job in a private school part-time And then I went to Little Plumstead Hospital for the children. Well, it was mainly for people with Down syndrome and things like that. And I got a part-time job as a nurse. So I had 2 jobs, enough to get money to. And then I had a bed sit, and the man, the husband of he was a horrible man. And he used to get me in the kitchen when I was trying to get, scrambled egg or something for my tea. And he'd get me up against the wall. And then he took the key away from my bedroom. And it was terrifying. And I had to put a chair under the handle to stop him coming in. When his wife went out, he was always trying to get in. And I was absolutely terrified. And in the end, I told Paul, because he thought we can't afford anything else. But when I told him this, he said, right, go and get the first flat you can. So I got a flat in Norwich. And these wonderful neighbours put a note through the door. There's a cup of tea waiting for you at number 1. I've always had angels,
Yes.
And they became dear friends. And they were just wonderful. They sort of supported me and looked after me. And I just visited 3 times a week. I had to go on the bus, of course. We had no money. And well, we got through it. And then he came out. And Kelling took him back again as doctor. And there was a flat for him to live in. But the matron said I wasn't allowed to live in it because it was a bad example to the nurses.
Even though you were married?
Yes. And of course, we had been told not to think of having children for at least 2 years because he'd had a massive operation. A great big chunk of his lung had been taken out. And we were told, because he had it at the right time, they just brought in PAS and streptomycin. And instead of dying, people were getting better. And of course, he got better. He got completely better from the TB. But he had a chunk of his lung out. So we were told not to think of any children for at least 2 years. So we took all suitable precautions, and I immediately became pregnant with twins, as one does. And so I was living in a flat we got a flat in Sheringham this time. And I was living, and I had the most appalling pregnancy. I was dreadfully sick, as you often are with twins. I didn't realise it, but it's one of the differential diagnoses of twins. And the silly doctor didn't realise I was having twins, and I was being dreadfully, dreadfully sick. And it really was absolutely ghastly. And I was living alone, and I used to spend the mornings sort of wrapped in an eiderdown with my head over the lavatory. And I could eat Rivita and Marmite were my saving grace. And Paul was allowed to come and see me because he was working full time. I saw him every other Sunday in the afternoon. Otherwise, I was completely alone. And I couldn't go to church because I was being sick all the time. And of course, I couldn't make friends because I was being sick all the time. And I was living in, it was the Grand Court Hotel had been turned into flats. And there's only one other tenant who was a major from the army with alcohol problems. So there wasn't anyone to be friendly with.
No. So then the twins were born in Sheringham?
No, well, actually, the Cromer Hospital in those days had a maternity unit at West Brunton. They were born there. And because Paul was still working at Kelling, so I was still alone. And again, I had angels throughout my life. And the matron, because Paul said, you've got to breastfeed because we're going back to Africa and you must breastfeed. So anyway, I wanted to. And the matron there, she was an absolute horror. And she said, don't be ridiculous. Of course you can't breastfeed twins. And anyway, she went on holiday. And I'm talking about angels again. I had so many in my life. And this crabby little old woman came in, brought back from retirement to take over while she was away. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I remember her standing at the end of my bed and saying, right, dear, I believe you want to breastfeed. And I said, I am going to breastfeed. Absolutely. She said, it's the right thing to do. But she said, we're going to do it with checks. We're going to test weigh them before and after to make sure they're getting enough. And if they're not, we'll top them up. And, she kept me in for 3 weeks. And most people only stayed in for 2 or 3 days. She kept me in for 3 weeks to look after me.
Excellent. And then you went to Africa.
Well, I went back to the flat, and then when Paul was classed as free and clear, we went back when the babies were born in the October, and we went back the following April. So they weren't very old.
No.
And they had been a bit premature, not a lot, but Mary in particular was very tiny. But thanks to that totally, utterly wonderful old nurse, she did very well, and she was doing fine. And because you went on a boat in those days, so we went on the Elder Dempsey line from Liverpool, and we sailed to Freetown, where we duly arrived and were met by missionaries. And we stayed with the chairman of the district in Freetown. And on the Sunday afternoon, we were taken as a treat to see the missionary tombs, graves.
Lovely.
Well, Freetown, Sierra Leone was known as the white man's grave. And missionaries, if they were lucky, lasted about 6 weeks in the early days. They all got malaria and died, including the children. So having seen the missionary graves, we then went up country to Seguema, which was about 200 odd miles by Land Rover and mud roads. And it was really, it was still a bush hospital. And there was a doctor already there, because Paul had been in charge at in Kenya, but of course that post had been filled, so we were sent to Sierra Leone. And so we settled in, and amazingly the children survived all sorts of tropical illnesses. And it was pretty rough going. It really was. It was not easy. And the climate in Sierra Leone is pretty awful. It's very, very, very hot and humid. And there were driver ants and scorpions and snakes and all sorts of other delightful things. And not, well, because the mosquitoes were the chief bane of one's existence.
So now I get in the middle. Which one was the twin, Mark or Michael?
Mark and Mary are the twins.
Mark and Mary are the twins,
and Mark's
right?
the minister, and Mary is, she became a teacher. And she now lives, of course, locally now. I haven't got her near, but Mark's a minister in Chessington.
And then where was Michael born?
We were told not to have any more children because we hadn't got enough money. And because we're twins, and we got our boy and girl, we were so fortunate. And obviously they were growing up and I was teaching them. And we were told not to, we were told ourselves we're not going to have any more children because we can't afford it. Missionaries aren't paid a great deal. And it's, we knew it was going to be tight. So I say we took all suitable precautions, and I gave away all the baby clothes. And then I discovered I was pregnant with Michael. All our children were accidents, but I like to feel they were divine accidents. And
yes.
But I decided that as children born in Sierra Leone, the first thing that happened to a newborn baby was that anti-malarials were stuck in their poor little mouths. And I thought, I'm not having this. And also I'd had an awful time having the twins. And I thought, well, I'm going to go home and have Michael in England. And we got a little cottage in Sheringham to go home to. We had bought a little cottage. We bought it for £1,100, can you believe? All the money we had in the post office. And we had this little cottage to go back to. And I said, I'm going back home to have Michael. And which is what I did. And so Michael was actually born in London, the Royal Free, and then I went back to Sheringham. And our little cottage now has been made quite posh, but it was a little fisherman's cottage when we lived in it, just round the corner from the beach. And I had an incredibly happy 6 months there with the twins and Mikey. And we used to go down every afternoon. It was a lovely summer that year. We used to pack the picnic in the pram, and we go down, and my incredibly ingenious twins used to make sorts of wonderful buildings and castles and things on the beach, and Michael used to sit in the sun. It was lovely. We had a lovely summer.
So then when did you feel your call to ministry?
When I was 7 years old, when I was at Dalston Lane.
They wouldn't accept you then, though, would they?
Well, no, but I did know I wanted to be a minister then. When I said to my mother, I want to be a minister when I grow up. And she said, but darling, they don't have ladies, which was a great disappointment. But it was always with me, I suppose. But I mean, really being 3 children, and then as a teacher. And of course, what happened was we came home from Sierra Leone, I think after about 8 years there. And there was an emergency in Kenya where Paul had been at Mawa. And instead of going back to Sierra Leone, which is what we fully expected, we were redirected and told we were going back to Mawa, where Paul had lived all those years before. So we went back to Mawa, having left everything, of course, in Sierra Leone. So we lost a lot of stuff. And we went to Mawa, and that was much more of a bush hospital in many ways. There was, of course, no electricity. But an interesting little fact, which I find very fascinating, is that when Paul had been in Mawa all those years before in the 1950s, he'd had, because he was a scientist as well as a doctor, he knew about German technology and about, can you believe, solar panels. And he'd installed solar panels at the Mawa Hospital to provide hot water for the whole hospital in the 1950s. He was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And of course, they were still there when we got back. But I loved Mawa. Climate in Kenya is beautiful. It's like a lovely summer day. And there are far less driver ants. There are snakes, but not so many. And I didn't see a single scorpion. I'm sure they were around, but we were living in a national park, a wildlife park. So there was always the danger of lions and leopards and whatnots, patrolling. But we had a sort of fence around, which we like to hope would keep out the more dangerous wild animals. And we had a wooden house, a bit terrifying because we were having messages from those across the border that they were going to come burn our house down and shoot us as we jumped out, which was a bit frightening.
Yes.
And of course, the Mau Mau had stopped, but there was still Mau Mau, warriors. A lot of young men had enjoyed being in the Mau Mau, and there was no way they were going back to be farmers. And so really what they became was highwaymen. And they used to stop white Land Rovers and rob them. And it was pretty terrifying, really. But what was so interesting about our Land Rover was it had a cross on it. And of course, Paul had been there and had looked after the Mau Mau. They brought their prisoners to him. They brought their wounded, and he was indiscriminate. He looked after anybody that was sick, regardless of whether they were Mau Mau or not. And so the result was that the Mission Hospital had a very, very high reputation with everybody, including the Mau Mau. And so I know I've told Tony this story, so he knows this one. But my job on Thursday was I drove the Land Rover all over. Mind you, I drove the Land Rover in Sierra Leone. I used to do a terrific lot of driving on those dreadful mud roads. But my job on Thursday mornings was to go with the children to Meru, which was 40 odd miles away on mountain track, all unmade roads, you realise. And I'd go there to a little Indian shop. There's a lovely, lovely Indian gentleman there. And he used to go to the railhead and collect all the stuff being sent up to us from Nairobi or Mombasa, all the drugs and the oxygen, all the medicines, all the stuff that we were needing. And every week it was my job on a Thursday morning to go and collect it. I didn't have to go to the railhead because this charming Indian used to get it for me. He was ever so sweet. And I used to be having a nice, gentle cup of coffee with his wife in the sitting room while he loaded the Land Rover. He was incredibly sweet. But I have told Tony this story, but one day I was driving to Meru, and we were bowling along merrily with the children when we were stopped at gunpoint by, of course, these these highwaymen, and they stopped the Land Rover, and they came to the door, and I said, okay, where do you want to go? And they said the village they were going to, and I said, okay, hop in. So they all hopped in, and they took my children on their laps, and because they were all fully armed. But I do remember saying to the children, don't touch the triggers, darling, they will be loaded. I mean, it's terribly funny, but the thing was that we were safe. I mean, we always were aware we could have been killed because there were a lot of unsavory folks around, but we were safe because what the mission had done, and they respected us, and they treated us with great respect. And so, of course, they all got out to thank me very much. Got out when we got to the village they were going to. There were about 6 of them, I think. They all piled in somehow, and they all got in, but they did. And the children were quite used to it.
So then what year did you come back to England for good?
Well, what we didn't know that I'd caught while we were in Sierra Leone, I had amoebic dysentery, and I'd got amoebic hepatitis, and I was very ill. And I went to see a doctor in Nairobi, and he said, you've got to go home. You've got to go to the Tropical Disease Hospital. And well, Paul intended to stay on his own, but I remember this consultant saying, you're a husband and a father. Your duty is to your wife. I think Paul would have been quite happy to have stayed on alone in Africa. He was totally dedicated. So instead of that, he came home. I went home first and went to the Tropical Disease Hospital, and the children were looked after by some friends. And then I was there for a time. And then Paul came home and actually came to the Tropical Disease Hospital, and we went home together. And I'd been treated by that time, and I sort of recovered. And we went home to Sheringham, and we didn't know what we were going to do because he was jobless. And we got a job, funnily enough, at where I'd nursed at the Little Plumstead. They were desperately wanting doctors. And we got a job there, and it was good because it had a house with it. So we went there, and the children went to Little Plumstead School, which was a Church of England school, and very nice. And they went there. And then because I was still quite poorly, the doctor one of the doctors at the Little Plumstead said, what do you want? I think he was Hungarian. He said, you want a good doctor, and I know a good doctor in Akel. And so instead of going to the local doctor, this doctor from Akel came, and he was called Michael Copeland. And he was a very good doctor, and he took us under his wing. What we didn't know was that they were looking for another partner, and he invited Paul to come and join. So we became partners in the Akel practice. And so we moved to Akel, and then we were there for not very long, about a couple of years. And then the doctor at Reedham, they were dissatisfied. They didn't want to live in a small village, and they were moving. And we were offered Reedham, and of course we were longing to live in a small village, having lived in Africa. So we moved to Reedham, to a lovely shabby old Georgian house with a huge garden, and it was just wonderful. We just loved it. And Paul had about 8 or 9 villages to look after, which suited us fine. And I got a job. I was teaching, and which was lovely. I was teaching at Lingwood. It was very good. And then, of course, we were there for about quite a lot of years. The longest I've always lived anywhere except since I've been here. And then, of course, Paul got sick, and he began to have little strokes and heart problems. And of course, it was before they brought in stents. He'd have lived today, but they hadn't got stents. And this was in the 1970s, and it was pretty ghastly. He was getting more and more frail, and I was having to drive him, and when I could, I was teaching. And then another total calamity. My daughter had glandular fever very, very badly. And instead of going away, it left her with what was called a manic depressive illness. She went completely doolally. And we were told to forget we'd had a daughter. She was going to be a vegetable. And we had a very Christian doctor. No, we first of all, a very atheistic doctor who said that all her delusions were our fault because we were Christians. We taught her a load of rubbish. Then we had a very Christian doctor who was very fundamentalist. And he said, of course, it was all our fault because we didn't believe in the right way. And I remember a sister in the hospital, she was admitted for a short time, telling me it was all my fault because of the way I'd brought her up. And then we had another angel. I told you I've got angels. Well, we had several, actually. Mary's school friends were angels, and they came and visited us. And the other people who were angels, because all our smart professional friends dropped us like hot potatoes, and didn't want to know, it was not a respectable illness. And the people who were loyal, of course, were the village Methodists.
Mm.
They were totally wonderful. But then our angel appeared, and he'd been with us when we were in Sierra Leone. He'd come as a VSO and had been so inspired by my husband that he'd switched from law to medicine at Cambridge. And he was, by this time, he was the senior registrar at St. Thomas's Hospital. And they were coming up, he and his wife was also a doctor. They were coming up every other weekend when they were off because they knew we were in such trouble. And he said, he rang us up, I remember, because they had a brilliant doctor at St. Thomas's who had found a new way of treating adolescent girls with problems. And he rang us up and said, I have made an appointment for you on Tuesday with Dr. Pollitt. You will be there. It's 11 o'clock. And he rang off. So we were there. And this amazing doctor started off by saying, now, before we start, you must understand that this is nobody's fault. It's not Mary's fault. It's not your fault. She's got a chemical disturbance, and we're going to cure it with chemistry. And in 3 years, she'll be leading a normal life, and in 5 years, she'll be well. He was wrong. Because in 2 years, she was leading a normal life. And in 4 years, they discharged her as well.
Excellent. So then, we're running, I think you'll have to be a part 2 next month.
We've only just begun.
Yes, I know.
But it was when Paul was dying, because he died in my arms before Mary was fully better, actually. And when he was dying, I think I remember on the night he died, he wanted me to sing Rock of Ages. And then he said, he knew he was dying, of course. And he said, at last, you'll be free to do what you know you always should have done.
And that was enter the ministry.
Well, yes, to enter the ministry. Yeah.
So
I think he knew it more clearly than I did.
Yeah. So were you in the first wave of female ministers?
No, it was about the second or third wave by the time I got
Oh,
there.
right, yeah.
But it was quite extraordinary because I was accepted remarkably quickly. I think mainly because I'd done theology at college, and I'd been a missionary training college. I'd done a lot of theology there. And so I didn't have to, I wanted to go to college, but they wouldn't let me. And of course, I'd been a missionary. And of course, I was a local preacher. I became a local preacher when I was 17. My class leader had felt called for me. So I'd become a local preacher at 17. So I'd been a local preacher in Africa. I'd taken services there. And so I sort of got straight in, which I cheated, really. I mean, I don't think anyone else came in quite the way I did. Remarkably unprepared, really. I've had a funny life, Pippa.
You have indeed. I think I shall have to admit to Jackie that we didn't get all the way through.
No,
because there may well be people who want to ask questions now. So I will admit to Jackie that we didn't do all your life, and I think you need to be part 2 next month. And that'll save her thinking of anybody else, won't it? So is there anybody, let me go to there, is there anybody who would like to ask Rosemary any questions up to this point of her offering for the ministry? And if not, we'll go.
They're all bored still.
They're all
Yes. How long were you in Sierra Leone,
8 years.
Rosemary? And then how long were you in Kenya?
I bet another 2 years. But no, it's 2 years.
So
And that's when I was ill and had to come home.
So Mark was 10 years abroad, and Mary.
Yeah, they were brought up in Africa.
Yeah. And how did they cope with being educated in Africa and then coming back to the UK? Did they find a big difference?
Yes, I think they did. I mean, I taught them. They both read very quick. Well, they read very quickly, but of course Michael was just sort of school age when we came home, so it was all right for him. But I think Mark found it much more difficult than Mary. Mary fitted in very much more quickly. Mark's a bit more uncouplable than Mary. I mean, you know Mark, Sarah and Geraldine, you know what he's like. He's a one-off. And he found it all very, very difficult. And he went to Kingswood because we thought that was the best thing. Actually, I think it was the worst thing that could have happened to him, really, because he hated it. But I mean, he's just very bright. He won't have you, he gets furious if I say that, but he's very bright. Well, you know that, Geraldine and Sarah, you've known him long enough. Yeah. And you know what he's like. Yeah. But I think he found it very hard. But they got on fine in Africa. The Africans adored them. Mm-hmm. And it was quite mutual. I mean, they played with the children and they used to get cuddled and hugged. And, you know, they were just brought up in Africa and they loved it.
Anyone else?
Flatten them all.
Yeah.
Totally bored stiff.
I'd like to ask a question.
Go.
Heather.
Rosemary, what years were you in Nigeria?
I wasn't. I never went. Yeah, I was appointed there, but that's where they were so cross with me because I got engaged to Paul. And so instead of going out to Nigeria as a teacher, which is what was in plan for me, I went as a missionary wife to Sierra Leone. And I did teach there. I taught English as a foreign language because the poor African students, I felt so sorry for them because they had to learn, you know, they came from different tribes and they all had different languages. But English, and there's no way that all the medical studies they had to do were going to be translated into all these different African languages. So English was the common language. So I taught English.
I asked you that question because I thought you said you did go to Nigeria because when I was a child, and it would have been in the 50s, I went to school, Sunday school, and our rector had two sons. This was at Church of England, and both sons were missionaries in Nigeria.
Yes.
And when these two chaps came home, they were just so lovely. I just worshipped. I thought they were wonderful. And they used to show slides, which because we never saw things. It's like going to the pictures.
Yes.
And we used to sing "Over the Seas, There Are Little Brown Children."
That's right. Yes. That's right.
And we had a missionary box in the shape of a brown loaf, which we used to collect money for them to go out to Nigeria.
Yeah. Well, I collected as a child for, of course, JMA, the Methodist mission. But no, I didn't go to Nigeria. We went to Sierra Leone, but I did teach. I also taught in the school. There was a school for boys, and can you believe I taught maths, which is not my subject. I used to keep a sort of page ahead because none of the African teachers wanted to teach maths. I should have taught English, which was much more sensible, but I taught maths to these boys. I had 60 boys in the class. They were all supposed to be coming up to 13, ready to take the exam to go on to the next school. But honestly, the 13, they didn't have birth certificates and some of them had moustaches. And I used to say, "How old are you?" And say, "I'm 13. They were
Oh,
great fun. They
Yeah,
were
I
great
bet.
fun, those boys. I used to love teaching them.
I bet.
Michael used to sit under the desk and play with his dinky toys.
You've led such a wonderful,
Yeah.
all the varied experiences that
Well,
you've
it's
had.
been mixed, yes.
Yeah,
It's been
gosh,
mixed.
absolutely. Yes. What an incredible life you've led.
It had
Yeah.
its moments. It had some very
Indeed.
frightening moments too, I can tell you.
Well, you've experienced, what it's like to be without money.
Well, we weren't
And-
without money, but we didn't have a lot, we put it that way.
No, that's right. Not a lot to spare.
No.
And also having the privilege of being respected.
To some extent, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
Mark always insists that compared with people in most places, we're rich. And he's right, of course.
Absolutely,
yeah.
aren't we? Well, we're so blessed.
Yeah.
We really are. But your faith has got you through an awful lot of stuff.
Ah, well, yes.
So
Somebody
do you
said
go on?
No, I was just going to say, somebody said the other day within our church, I don't mean at Hingham, I mean within our circuit, well, life is tough, but God is good. And it's that kind of faith that keeps you going through the tough times, isn't it? And good times.
Well, if you sign on for a Christian, you rather expect that it's going to be tough, don't you? I mean, Jesus did say, it's not going to be easy.
Absolutely.
He didn't
It's not
promise
a bed
it.
of roses.
No, he didn't promise it. He said, he used much worse similes, but, he said, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be tough going. I mean, he used the idea of take up your cross, which is a pretty hideous thought. But, he did warn us, so we accepted. My husband was totally dedicated. He was about 99.9% missionary.
Ah,
And we just
good
went along
man.
with it. He was a good man. He was an incredibly good man.
yeah.
But it
I
doesn't
could
make for
tell.
easy living necessarily.
No.
Oh, thank you for telling us all of that.
He was very handsome too. He was a tall, good-looking man.
Oh, well, no wonder you fell. Quick.
Oh, yes. Well, he loved me. He loved me and I loved him.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, that's grand.
Right. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? One thing we just thought, do you speak any other languages besides English?
I got by in Sierra Leone with Mendy because I could do some Mendy. I've forgotten it all now, but in Sierra Leone, I did try a little bit. There were so many languages. Swahili, I did try a little bit with that. Not what am I talking about? Is that what I mean? Swahili, the common language in East Africa. I can't remember. I did try a bit of that, but in all honesty, I didn't really. I was so busy teaching the children by this time. They were older by this time, and we were having to spend much longer on proper lessons because I was responsible for their education, and I did teach in the Sunday school, but with a translator. So I really was having to concentrate on being a full-time teacher with my children because it depended on them. I read them the whole of The Lord of the Rings, 3 volumes, on the wet afternoons when the rain was coming down.
And did they learn any of the African languages?
They got bits from the children in Sierra Leone, but they didn't in them. And of course, the students were all very good at English. I mean, they had to be poor souls because otherwise they couldn't have done their studies. So it was in Kenya, it was different from Sierra Leone.
Right. Well, I think, are we coming towards the end?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course you can, Cliff.
Yes, Rosemary, I understand you have written a couple of hymns.
I've written a lot of hymns.
Yes. When did you start writing them? Did you write some when you were in Africa?
I started writing hymns, I think, when I was about 10 or 11.
Wow.
I've always written poetry. I love poetry.
Ah,
I've only got one hymn in the hymn book.
only one in the hymn book.
Oh yes, I've only got one in the hymn book.
Oh,
But I just love writing Christian poetry. I've written Christian poetry. Most of my poetry is Christian.
right.
I just like poetry.
Okay.
But I did start writing poetry when I was a child, so it's nothing new.
Oh,
It comes of not going to school, you see. I was educated at home by the BBC.
Yeah. Right. Is there anybody else? No. Well, I will make my confession to Jackie when she returns from holiday and say that I was a very poor interviewer because I didn't get you moving along.
Oh, we moved at breakneck speed.
We did. But there was a lot to say, possibly because you've lived such a long time.
yeah.
I am seriously old.
So thank you very much, Glyn, for hosting. Thank you very much, Rosemary, for giving us your life story. And thank you very much, everybody else.